This is Humans of the World with Pascal Risk. Inspiring stories of people from all around the globe. Tune in every Wednesday. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first episode of Humans of the World. I am extremely honored today to have as my first guest my friend, Dr. Rina Smail. Rina, welcome to Humans of the World.
Thank you, Pascal. It's my honor to be participating in this special program of yours that you've been preparing for a long time and talking about it with me for quite some time now.
Yeah, absolutely. Indeed, it is because whenever we talk, we spend so many hours talking. And I thought it would be interesting to share some of the input we exchange with my audience. And Dr. Rina is a clinical psychologist and an assistant professor in psychology. So, Rina, when I first started thinking about this podcast, I wanted to share with people inspiring stories. Now, definitely inspiring, it is relative. So they are inspiring to me in the first place, but they get to be different for others. Maybe we get inspired in different ways. So my first question to you is, how can the narrative of the other contribute to our healing?
Quite a big question. It depends on the type of narrative also and the context of using narrative. We use narrative sometimes in the context of the clinic. We all are exposed to different types of narrative through ancient traditions, oral traditions, mystic and religious stories, social media, movies, and each has its own format, its own audience. In general, stories, as you said, have the function of inspiring others. And that's partly because stories typically engage our imagination and they engage our emotions, and thus they can move us or motivate us to action.
Yeah, because when you talked about the emotions, and this is what happens when we share our personal things. Like, no matter where we are, where we stand, if we are introvert, extrovert, if we are good at talking about ourselves or we find difficulty doing so, there's a common knowledge or understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that whenever we share, we feel lighter and something becomes easier. Is
so
that
here,
really true?
Yeah. So here you're talking about the person sharing the story. And
Yes.
I can definitely relate to that as on the personal level and on the professional level. And on the personal level, this is something I've experienced quite a bit with you and my closest friends. When I'm going through some turmoil, when my emotions are overwhelming me, and my own story is becoming somewhat, or it feels like it's becoming somewhat bigger than me, bigger than my capacity to understand. I use my friends as my outlets or as my mirror, because one of the functions of having a good friend is that they can mirror back to you what they're seeing in you as you're sharing the story, what they're hearing, and they kind of can give it back to you. So yes, sharing the story has this, and take the clinic, for example, when we are encouraging our clients or patients to share their story. We are also facilitating that kind of understanding, because one way we can understand is through narrating, because as you try to narrate a story, you are in effect trying to put things together. You are somewhat trying to create a timeline. You're trying to create a sequence. You're trying to create a meaning. And in fact, when clients struggle with narrating a story that has these features, oftentimes it's an indicator that there is a trauma that's disrupting that, because actually one of the characteristics of a trauma is that it lacks cohesion. when we're traumatized, I don't know if you want me to get into that at this time. I mean, I wasn't planning to get into trauma, but when
Yes,
I went to the clinic,
we always go back there in order to heal ourselves and to try to be the better version of who we are and to live like.
But to go back to the story
happier.
that everybody is sharing a traumatizing story, and especially if it's a story they haven't come to terms with. You might find that the story lacks this sense of coherence or meaning. Actually, as we try to facilitate their sharing the story, we are trying to facilitate their ability to put things together and to integrate this quote unquote traumatizing story into the bigger story or the bigger context of their lives. Now, traumas have the ability, if well processed, to actually push the boundaries and push the existing meaning in our own lives. So it's not just a static integrating that traumatizing story into a story that's already there, but the trauma has this capacity, hopefully, if well processed, and if you're fortunate enough to have a context that allows you to do this processing, it does have this potential to push the boundaries in your life, to push the meaning, create new meanings, perhaps. This is why we talk about post-traumatic growth.
Can everybody process their trauma? Is it something feasible for everybody? And what are the key elements to do so? Like you said so many things, I want to go back to them, but I'm curious to know, can everybody do this?
In principle, we as clinicians and as mental health professionals like to believe that we do have this innate healing capacity to heal. So in principle, we are born with this capacity. However, the more traumatizing the event is, the more protracted the trauma is, the younger we are when the trauma starts in our life. And I have in mind here developmental complex traumas or traumas related to prolonged torture, to imprisonment, where the element of time is protracted and confiscated at once. Like you're traumatized for a long period of time, but a characteristic of that traumatization is that you start to have a really constricted sense of time, constricted sense of hope, and your resources become challenged. Especially if you're a child and you haven't had the resources yet well developed. I mean, this becomes that if you're lucky enough to have access to somebody who can provide this compassion once the trauma is over. So here I'm talking about a trauma that's over. Now, there are people who are living in ongoing traumas, and that becomes even more complex. But let's talk about people who have whose trauma is over in the sense of circumstances that led to it, because the trauma does continue to live within our souls. But let's say the person has been traumatized by abusive parents, or let's say the person has been traumatized by X or Y. So when that interaction stops, and if they begin to realize that they need to look within, that they need to work on themselves, and then the journey can begin. And then different factors can complicate or facilitate that journey. I mean, there are different elements that I can get into, but I'm not sure if you want to focus on the traumas as much in this episode.
No, I want to give hope. But because I wanted this program to bring stories that can probably trigger something in people, to lead them to rethink their lives, probably enjoy what they have, cherish happy moments, but giving the other the possibility to become an opportunity for us to understand something while just doing some chores or doing something at home. So that's the idea behind the program. What I understand and what I would like to talk to you about is the importance of the other. Like we are in this life and we are not isolated. We are continuously interacting with the others. What is the role of the other whenever we are trying to deal with something or going into therapy?
So When I was talking
By the
about
other, allow me to tell you what I mean by the other is every person surrounding us.
yes, sure,
Yeah.
sure. And thank you for highlighting that. So when I started talking about healing from trauma or healing in general, I talked about the power or value of mirroring
Yes.
back to the person the reality that's unfolding in the context of an interaction. So actually, what facilitates healing and recovery in the clinic is primarily the relationship that begins to form between the client and the therapist. However, uh, the long term goal of facilitating recovery in the context of this relationship is to facilitate the person's ability to connect on a deeper level with one's own self and to create more meaningful and lasting connections in one's life.
Yeah, it shows that sometimes malfunctioning of our inner self is due to this capacity or this incapacity of us to to process chaos, chaos of emotions, of ideas, of existential questions. Now,
Mhm.
I would like to ask you, Rina, now with your work, we talk a lot these days of mental health and the importance of
Mm.
mental health. I
Mm.
I believe this is, however, something that only elite people can allow themselves to think about because of there's so many traumas around the world and people living in different circumstances. Probably in some populations, there's no space for mental health. Now, in your job and according to your experience, what are the most common things people suffer from today?
Okay, so you posed two big questions. So one related to a genuine dilemma we have in the field is that yes, uh, it can seem to that seeking professional help is costly, and that
Yes.
it is accessible for the people who have the means. Now, in some countries, mental health is becoming integrated in insurances. In some companies, they actually do cover mental health. You're talking about, I guess, a bigger problem. You're talking also about the communities at large, perhaps people who are not professions or who are not living in countries that have that kind of coverage.
Yes, and
Uh,
probably culturally are not, oriented towards thinking about mental health, just like physical health.
yes, yes. So this is something I reflect on, but honestly, I don't know that I have answers for that. I know that communities do have their healing rituals that
Yes.
may not involve the typical one-to-one therapist interaction. And perhaps here where the power of narrative comes in. I mean, people in the context of relating to each other, of using, drawing on ritual, the drawing on narrative, drawing on even communal connections. I mean, there's a lot of healing that happens naturally in that context. Now, you are talking about people who might have severe mental illnesses, such as people with perhaps suicidal depression or
And these
severe.
people would require the intervention of psychiatrists, I suppose.
I mean, we suppose that partly because, as academics, we rely on research. Now, the
Yes.
problem is that research requires funding. So we have to also acknowledge and admit that our knowledge is biased by that and limited by that. So I can only speak from that base. So the research, I don't have research, I mean, access to well developed research about how people from severe mental illness healed without seeking this kind of professional help. Perhaps there is this line of research or somebody's beginning to work on it. But I don't have the answers for that. So back to severe mental illness. And we usually, as professionals, try to encourage people to seek professional help when there are severe symptoms. I've worked not only in outpatient settings, I've worked on inpatient settings. And that allowed me to see severe cases and allowed me to see severe cases from different walks of society. And it gave me access to handling cases, for example, with psychosis. And you might know that psychosis sometimes can get intermingled with cultural and spiritual values, because even if the person is ill, they do retain an aspect of their culture.
Of course.
So for example, one of the symptoms of psychosis that we see, that I saw on the inpatient unit, might have involved patients who felt that they had a special relationship with God or with Jesus, and that they've been called upon to fulfill a great mission. And it can be tricky because, I mean, you don't want to impose a belief system on someone, and you don't want to judge someone's thought as being delusional. And what if you don't know much about that subculture? Who are you to come from the outside and make judgments on that? But as clinicians, we have a few principles that we work with. For example, if we have somebody presenting with psychotic symptoms, we don't treat people just because they say, I have the power to heal and I have a special relationship with God. I mean, everybody's entitled to believe what they want to believe. But when this starts to affect their functionality, when this starts to affect their well-being, when this starts to affect their interactions with others, so oftentimes when we have patients like that, we've worked closely with their families. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, families were good informants in a context like that. The family itself might have been religious in one of the cases. And the grandmother herself said, the way the person reports hearing God's voice, it just doesn't seem spiritual. I mean, it does seem to be an illness because of what she knows of the person. Now, of course, somebody might question that and say, what if it's an abusive family? I mean, I don't have in mind here the extraordinary case of an abusive family. And I'm talking more about the everyday cases we deal with. So we do rely on a better understanding of the person's culture through the family, through having a link with the community that can teach us about how does that fit in the context of that person's milieu. And this came to my mind because you were talking about this boundary between depending on communal healing and facilitating professional help. So here's an example of people who came from the village. And they, I mean, obviously they had some access, they had some but they could tell. What I'm trying to say is that in these cases, unlike what we might think, in the severe cases at least, the community knows better than what we think. They actually did know that something was off.
Yeah. Now there's a very important intuitive feeling.
And that was really
I'm sorry, because of the connection, we have a delay in the sound.
Yes. So this honestly taught me a lot about also trying to listen to the person's family closely, try to understand the holistic context the person is coming from. They educate us on their culture. They have the intuition, as you say, and then we educate them as professionals on the symptoms as we understand them from a scientific angle. And we educate them on the alternatives to healing that we also have as professionals, which might include medication. And here sometimes we have to do some education. Some people are more open to medication than others. Some people are open to medication, but not to psychotherapy, and the other way around.
And this is where I come. And this is where I come with my final question to you. A lot of people today, because we are dealing with collective anxiety at all levels, a lot of people today resort to taking medicine without going into therapy. Like they would know somebody that can provide them with something, or they have a very special relationship with their family doctor and can provide some subscription, but without going down to the roots and see where does their anxiety stem from. But what is your stand on that?
Actually, when I came back from Canada to Lebanon in 2014, I noticed that there was a lot of that happening. I'm not saying that it's stopped now, but at that time, psychology was just beginning to form, clinical psychology in the sense of becoming a regulated profession. Actually, the field just began to be regulated in 2017. So even though, so there were psychologists working in the country, but not necessarily licensed, there were no parameters, and psychiatry was more accessible. And yes, the medication tended to be overprescribed. It could be partly the physician's bias at the time, and it could be also because the person associates healing with the clinician they're used to, their family physician, their psychiatrist, or the neurologist. Many people actually seek neurologists because if you reflect actually on the Arabic language, the colloquial Arabic, we refer to the psychiatrist as Hakim Asab.
Yes.
I allowed myself to speak in Arabic. And Hakim Asab means, if I want to apply a literal translation, a physician of nerves.
Yes. Yes.
Okay? And so there is actually some connection between neurology and psychiatry. I can't deny that.
So, Dr. Ghena, so far we talked about the effects of the narrative on the person telling their stories. And we took time to dwell into that. Now, what about the effect on the persons who are listening to the stories, just like my audience, for instance?
Okay. But, in the beginning of the conversation, I mentioned that there are different types of stories. And as I said, I'm glad to be in the first episode with you. I still don't know what kind of stories there are going to be in your series. They're going to be social media stories. When I think of stories, I think of different types of stories. And I've been personally touched by all these different types of stories in different phases of my life. And I've shared sometimes aspects of these different stories with my friends, and also as a professional with my clients in the clinic. When you think of stories, I mean, there are the stories that we see when we're watching a touching movie. I mean, that's there are stories that come to us through the oral tradition, the family tradition, stories that my grandpa shared with me, stories that my dad or great aunt shared with me. And I don't know if there's going to be room to pause on these different kinds. I mean, when I think of these stories, some of them are Sufi stories. My grandpa has been a Sufi all his life.
I'm looking forward to having you as a guest to talk about your personal story.
Yes.
You promised me to have time to do that.
Hopefully. When I think of my grandpa and the Sufi stories you told me, that's a different genre, because Sufi stories usually have symbolism attached to them. And here, actually trying to apply these stories in a literal way can be untherapeutic as opposed to being therapeutic. And that's why Sufi stories, especially Sufi stories that come from more of the older times, they have this, they can be brief, but they're filled with symbolism, metaphor, allegory. It's kind of up to the listener to digest or interpret these stories over time. And now that I have in mind the stories that Grandpa shared with me, I can see how over time I interpret these stories in a different light, depending on the developmental stage I was in.
So there's always a risk. I'm sorry to interrupt you. There's always a risk of interpreting wrongly the stories we hear or we listen to.
I mean, I don't know about wrongly. I mean, there's no right or wrong interpretation. But you can be, when you're younger, we do tend to be more absolutist, maybe more enthusiastic, and we might not capture the nuance in its fullness.
This brings me back to something very simplistic, if I may say. When we are young, or this is something a lot of people share, I have the tendency to observe. So I grew up observing people. Like if I'm in the car with my parents, I would look at the houses and start with the imagination, just like you mentioned, to create stories for these people. And as you also just said, while evolving and growing up with maturity and bringing in realistic factors, these stories tend to become like more real, concrete, less imagination, but more interaction with the right people. And then we move to this part where sometimes we probably see the unattainable in the other story. Like I would see something or listen to something and I would only wish to have things or people or and that's a risk, right? Like when you tend to personalize or tailor made the story to your own traumas and needs, and
you're putting a lot here already. So I'm gonna focus on a notion that's implicit in what you said, which we call social comparison. or
Oh,
unfavorable social comparison.
yeah.
And that happens a lot, by the way, through social media nowadays, Facebook.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know if you can refer to these as stories, but I mean, they are a kind of story, the pictures people put, which give
Yeah.
you a sense of the happy story in their life.
Yeah.
And then others start comparing their lives to that, and comparing their lives to what's not attainable in their own lives. And yes, that can have actually an adverse effect on the person. Uh, and sometimes it might be actually, as I said, a symbolic story. And here I wouldn't talk about an inherent risk in symbolism, but symbolism by nature cannot be exhausted in its
Yes.
fullness once. You're going to absorb it over time. There are layers in the story. So it depends on the kind of story we're talking about as well, and what you're choosing to absorb. Now, in the clinic, if I decide that this is a moment where I can share an aspect of a story with my client, I tend to be careful about what I want to highlight in that story. Okay?
Okay.
Yes. So I work with clients from different backgrounds, and some of them are religious, for example, some of them are not. So let's say I decide I want to draw on a religious narrative. I'm particularly careful in how I contextualize that, because I don't want to end up moralizing.
Mhm.
But I find some of the grand narratives exist in religious and mystic traditions, and they're beautiful. And they're shared at a collective level in some societies. So if I know that this narrative might be accessible to my client, I'll share it, but while being particular about what I want to highlight in that story. And it's usually a humanistic theme that I'm highlighting.
I hope that the podcast can bring stories, nice, easy, lovely, that can also be of great lessons to us. Probably not just lessons, probably just a moment to enjoy, to recall something we've been through, something we've experienced, and maybe get sometimes invitations to deal with things we're not dealing with. So I
Which
really
triggers
hope.
my curiosity here. So,
Yes.
is it going to be? So, are you going to tell us today a little bit about the format of these stories? And
So
is there a conversational aspect? Are you going to be part of the conversation if it's made up of conversations? I'm curious about that.
So the objective, the target is to bring in people and to conversate with them and try
Okay.
to mm, come up or bring to the surface aspects of their lives they feel free
Mm,
to talk about, and aspects that can other people resonate with. Of course, I'm going to
mm,
be interacting because this is me, this is my life,
mm,
my choices. However, I don't want it to be about me, but I'll definitely go whenever something is or happened or is similar to something I've experienced, of course.
I think what you say is wise and right on. I mean, you cannot not be part of the story, because this
Mhm.
story is happening in the context of a it is emerging in the context of a conversation. At the
Yes.
same time, you don't want it to be about you. And the mere fact that you have this notion in mind, I think, uh, gives the promise of a good story evolving.
I hope so. I am the first listener. I hope to
Mm,
be a good listener more
mm,
than the speaker. And
mm,
in all cases, looking forward to having you. I know you have
mm,
a very inspiring story, and I really hope that we will get to talk to you on the podcast for many, many, many times to come. And
mm.
I want to thank you deeply for this availability, Rina, and for the time you dedicated to talk about these aspects. I'm sure we had a lot of interesting inputs that we can go back to in separate, under separate topics and themes, and in relation to many stories.
Mm.
Um, would you like to say a last thing before we end up today?
I'm like everybody is on the outlook for this series, like everybody who's known about it and who's known about you, because uh, I know you have this capacity for deep listening.
Mhm.
And I know that you have this ability to touch people's, to bring up what's most meaningful uh, in a story. So I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for the encouragement. And I don't want to raise a lot the expectations, but I'm just going to take it simple and easy and try to be as much as we can. Thank you again. And looking
Thank you for
forward to
inviting
meeting you in person. Hopefully soon.
me. Yes,
Hopefully soon. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
That was Humans of the World with Pascal Risk. Available on Spotify and YouTube. Music by Gabriel Sassi.